Hello, I'm Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, joining you for another online presentation. I'm very happy to have you here with me today. And if you're watching the recording on YouTube, happy to have you there as well. If you are watching on YouTube, remember to hit the subscribe button. That'll let you know when we have new videos that come out. And if you have any questions and you are watching the recording, just go ahead and down in the comments section, if you have any questions, you're very welcome to put those questions down in the comment section. And I'll be able to come back and answer them for you. You're also, of course, welcome to contact me either by email or by phone. My information is right here on this first slide. So once again, thank you for joining me. Today, we are going to be talking about designing sustainable landscapes. And this really is going to give an introduction to a lot of different elements that go into sustainable landscapes. And hopefully, in some future programs, we're going to be able to kind of narrow down some of this topic into the specific elements and go into a little bit more detail. And I thought it's always a good idea to start with sort of a broad view of sustainable landscapes. And then we can, again, talk about the different elements with a little bit more focus. So one thing that I'm always wanting to make sure I do is defining what I mean by sustainable. And when I talk about sustainability, I really want to incorporate three different primary elements into that. And the first of that, of course, is making sure that how we design our landscapes is going to be good for the environment. We want to make sure that we have a reduced environmental impact, that we're providing space for wildlife, and certainly not having any runoff or issues like that. We also need to take care of the economic side of that question as well. It's great to have an environmentally friendly landscape, but we also need to make sure that we can afford it, that we're not doing things that just cost too much money. And then the last element of sustainability is socially sustainable. You want to make sure that it's something that is going to get along with all the people that are around, that your neighbors are going to be okay with, and it's going to help you have good relationships with all the people that are around you. So, when we talk about sustainable landscape design, we want to make sure that we're paying attention to a landscape that's functional, it's cost efficient. Ideally, we want it to be visually pleasing, and making sure that we're environmentally friendly. And what we want is a landscape that's in balance with our climate. We don't want to have to put in a lot of resources into that, so we don't need to spray, fertilize, apply pesticides all the time. And certainly, time is a major component of that as well. So again, we're just balancing the needs of our environment, our own needs, and the needs of the people around us, for a good sustainable environment and a good sustainable landscape. So there are three major elements that we want to talk about when we talk about sustainable design. And the first part of that is at the design stage. That means we want to design that landscape in harmony with our natural environment, so that it enhances the sustainable features of our home. One very simple example of that is using trees to provide shade for houses so that we can reduce some of our heating costs or some of our cooling costs. Conserving resources like water, conserving resources by composting, just all gives us ways to reduce the outside inputs that we need to put into our landscape. And then, protect means preventing or reducing anything that might pollute the environment. Reducing the use of gasoline or other fossil fuels that we would need to use in the environment, reducing the need for pesticides that we might need for control, whether that be of insects or diseases, anything like that. And I just want to just include a note here. It doesn't necessarily mean that the use of pesticides is inherently bad. Just like anything, it's a tool, and we want to use those tools at the appropriate time. Some really simple things that we can do in sustainable design. First off, is when we select plants, matching the plants to the conditions that we have. As I've said a number of times in other presentations, matching the plant to the conditions that we have is going to be a lot easier than trying to adapt our site to fit a plant that we want. Very often, I do advocate for the use of native plants, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. That's not to say that we have to use only native plants. Certainly, there are a lot of plants that we can really enjoy in our landscapes that aren't native to here in Mississippi. And But having native plants and incorporating those native plants can be an important part of sustainable design. And you can also incorporate legumes and nitrogen fixing plants into some designs that allows us to fix a little bit of nitrogen and reduce some of the fertilizer that we might otherwise need to use. And we can talk a little bit about more about that. So we talk about things like cover crops and green manures. Of course, we do want to conserve water. Of course, here in southeastern Mississippi, sometimes we're trying to divert water or cause water to percolate down rather than to necessarily conserve it. So we tend to have a fair bit of water, but we do want to be conscious of how water is running off because that can carry things out into our environment that we don't want to be moved. I think it's really important to use natural looking designs that can really reduce the amount of maintenance needs that we have in our landscape, in addition to creating a really good wildlife habitat inside our home landscape. And certainly, I have seen some wonderful formal designs and landscapes. That a really classic formal garden is a beautiful thing. But I also think that we can do a very good job with a more natural landscape that's going to be a lot easier to work with. And it's also going to incorporate a lot of features that really are more sustainable. Some benefits of having a sustainable landscape: it reduces pollution, it reduces waste disposal. All of those things are beneficial to the environment. It's going to be a good, safe environment for everyone in your family to be able to be out in that landscape. It's going to improve our water, not only water conservation but also increasing our water quality. Some things that I think are really particularly important, particularly for me, I work quite a bit. It's difficult for me to spend time in my home landscape. So a landscape that requires less maintenance and is still attractive is a very important quality for me. Certainly, reducing the amount of money and maintenance costs that need to go into maintaining our landscapes can be very important for all of us. We won't have the noise pollution. I have a neighbor that really liked to mow his lawn at 5 a.m. on Saturdays. And that wasn't my favorite thing there for a while. And of course, sustainable landscapes still perform the really important role of being attractive, pleasant places for us to be out in. So I'm going to start off talking about some different areas of sustainable design. We're going to start about talking about the use of native plants. And again, I don't think it's necessary to be a purist in the use of native plants. Incorporating some natives and some more exotic species is perfectly fine. I really enjoy my camellias and azaleas, and most, they're not native. Certainly, I have other plants in my landscape that are not native here to Mississippi and are absolutely gorgeous in my landscape. But I like to incorporate native plants because they are better adapted to our soils and to our climate. They're going to tolerate those conditions very well. They are really critical for the wildlife that I enjoy having in my landscape. And they tend to be a little bit less maintenance because they're so well adapted to the environment that they're in. That being said, you can use a native plant really just the same as you would any other ornamental garden plant. You're selecting it just the same. You're still selecting it according to the space that you would want it to live, to be in, the qualities of growth, the flower color that you're looking for. And there's some really easy ways for you to look around and figure out what kind of native plants are going to do well in your home landscape. And one way is just to look around at what's growing in the area around you. Now, on my drive home, I see a lot of pine trees, and I don't necessarily want to see a lot of pine trees in my home landscape, but there are also a lot of other understory plants, wildflowers that I see that do really well and that I can then incorporate into my home landscape. But maybe you have some trees that are already growing on the site. You have trees that are around your fence lines, might be on neighboring properties, and all of those demonstrate their suitability to the site of your landscape. And there's another thing that I want us to consider when we talk about native plants. Just because a plant may be native to Mississippi as a whole doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be the plant for your landscape. There are different environments. You have wet environments and dry environments. And so you want to select things that are going to be really well adapted to the conditions that you have. So as we're planting trees in new sites, we do want to pay attention. If this is an area where you've had new construction, there can be a lot of difficulty in establishing plants. Or even if your home and landscape is somewhere where you do have kind of an introduced soil, that can produce some challenges. And so you want to be conscious of that when you put them in. Pay attention. Is that plant going to be really exposed to hot conditions, a lot of sun? Is there not a lot of topsoil for it to grow in? And just choose plants that are going to be really tolerant of those conditions is really going to help the suitability to the site. Now, there is a long list of native trees that work very well in different landscapes in Mississippi. By no stretch of the imagination am I going to talk about all of these today. This is going to be one of those breakout sessions for a later topic to really talk about some individual native plants and their virtues in the landscape. But there are going to be just a couple that I mentioned because I particularly enjoy them. I am very fond of red maples. One thing that we don't get as much of down here is fall color. And so having that red maple there to give us a little bit of fall color is always wonderful. River birches have just really great bark for our really interesting appearance and do very well in wet areas. Of course, I love hollies. I think they do fantastic in landscapes. If someone asks me, what tree should I put here? Holly is going to be one that I go to very quickly because they're such a well adapted tree and they do so very well in our landscapes. They're kind of a no nonsense tree. Um, Magnolias, of course, the southern magnolia is our state tree and our state flower, and they are fantastic in landscapes. If you're looking for something a little bit smaller, we have a Sweet Bay magnolias and Little Jim magnolias that are kind of dwarf versions that don't get quite so large. Um, we have a profusion of oaks. Of course, the oak that everybody thinks of, first of all, is the live oak. And of course, they do fantastic if you've got a great large area for them to establish in. And so they're just a really, just a wide array of really beautiful trees. Southern crab apples I really like for their flowers. And you can see some of these plants out in the landscape doing very well. Again, they tolerate the conditions that we have here in Mississippi and provide really great specimen trees, really good border trees as well. In some cases, like some of the smaller hollies, they make very good hedges. So there are very, just a wide array of options here. And certainly we have a lot of native shrubs. Again, kind of the same situation. I'm not going to, get into all of these. Really recently, I've gotten more interested in our native azaleas, and there are certainly some gorgeous native azaleas, particularly like the flame azaleas. We do have shrubbier hollies that do very well. American beautyberry is another personal favorite. Really nice growing habit, tolerates shade and tolerates being in kind of wet conditions pretty well. Puts on really pretty berries in the fall, and all of these are just fantastic plants for our landscapes. So red buckeye with its fantastic flowers, just a lot of really good options for plants that we can integrate into our landscape. And again, these not only do well in our landscape, they are going to help support wildlife, and they tend to be pretty no nonsense, low maintenance plants. And we're going to talk a little bit about low maintenance plants a bit more as we move on. So we want to spend some time talking about water. We do want to avoid excess irrigation. A lot of that is just going to cause water to run off into street drains or off of our property, which is really just carrying our fertilizer away, and that's not something we want to do. Where we can capture rainwater that can help us get through some periods when we may not have any rain. We can put those into rain gardens. We'll talk about that a little bit. We can conserve water around trees by using mulch. And again, really only using proper use of any pesticides to make sure that we're not over applying those and letting those get out into our water system. Rain gardens are one of my favorite ways to manage water in the landscape. A lot of times I get called out to a landscape and asked to look at an area where water stands, and they want a way to fix that. And I think rain gardens are a really good solution because it really is just using that area where rainwater is accumulating. It's letting that rainwater filter down into the soil, but it's also growing some really attractive plants that are going to thrive in that area and produce a beautiful area in the landscape. So if you look at it, these are several pictures of different rain gardens. You can see how attractive they can be in the landscape. If you kind of looked underneath the ground, you can see there's a little bit of a concave area where water is going to be directed into that rain garden. There's a good level of soil that goes down. Oftentimes, there is a layer of gravel that really helps that water flow. And sometimes, kind of like a French drain, you actually have a drain and an outlet that allows some of that excess water to be directed away. But really, as the water comes into that area, it's going to percolate down into that planting soil, and it's going to be able to go down or be taken up by those plants that are selected to really thrive in those conditions. And I think this is, again, just a great way of taking what might be a difficult area in the landscape and turning it into one that really is just a gorgeous feature. And there are a lot of plants that work really well for us in rain gardens. Again, I like my red maples, so that's going to make my list there. Cypresses can do very well, though you do want to be conscious that they have a tendency to put up knees. Willows can work very well. If you want an interesting place to put in a fruit tree, mayhaws. Not only do they produce a fruit that you make an excellent jelly from, but they also have absolutely gorgeous flowers and make a really good specimen tree as well. Get those hollies in there, some sweet spire or button bush, all of those really good options for rain gardens. So, again, some really beautiful plants that are able to, tolerate those conditions, take up a lot of that water, and make use of it, and turn an area that might otherwise be kind of difficult into one that really looks gorgeous in the landscape. Now, this is kind of certainly a little bit more involved and not one that I would necessarily say is right for everybody. But we do use an awful lot of water in our households. And a lot of that water, while we might not consider it potable, we wouldn't want to drink it. There's nothing in it that would be harmful in the environment. And so we produce what we call gray water, and that separates it from what we would call black water or sewage. We certainly don't want to make use of that. That's why we have sewer systems and other things like that. But gray water, in a lot of cases, is perfectly fine to be used out in the landscape, and about makes up anywhere between half and 80% of the average volume that we use. So that's all of our dishwater, our shower water, our sink and our laundry water. And there are systems that take this gray water and essentially will collect it and send it out as an irrigation system. Now, again, if you've already got a house built, this is kind of involved to make such a large change in your plumbing. But I wanted to incorporate this just kind of as a sort of advanced sustainable design, particularly ones that are being looked at in more arid areas or dry areas where they don't have the abundance of water that we have. One thing I do think is really interesting, and again, this is something that would be relatively easy to integrate even into an established structure, is a green wall. And a green wall is just what it sounds like. It is a wall that you can plant things on. Oftentimes, these use a metal framework that supports a lightweight soil mixture or soil media. Very often, there's a membrane that's placed between the growing media and the wall surface, or there's a small gap. And it's watered by a drip irrigation system on the top that allows water to filter down through those wall panels and provide all the water needed by those plants. And so, what you wind up with, and uh, three of these are intentional green walls. One of this would be sort of I guess, an accidental green wall. Down on the bottom, you can see the ivy growing over that house. Probably wouldn't advocate for that, and certainly that the length of time that would be required for that to occur is pretty extensive. But you can see these other systems that have small plants with drip irrigation systems, and the virtue of this is that, first of all, if you just have a big blank wall, having a green wall there just looks really nice. It's a visually attractive feature. You can plant all sorts of interesting stuff on it. And it does have the benefit of cooling the sides of the building because it's preventing some of the contact from the sun. And that can reduce the indoor cooling needs that you have. In addition to that, it actually gives you a little bit of additional insulation. And so you're either going to be able to keep that cold in or keep the heat in the winter, and really do a good job of helping with our climate control inside the structure. It can also, if you live in an urban area, if there's a lot of traffic noise and things like that, it does act as a sound buffer. And plants are really important for improving our air quality. And even, green walls can even add in a little bit of additional wildlife habitat. So you can kind of see a diagram here. This is a little bit faint. Generally, you have a sheet that holds water, but will drain, and that's used as a soil media. Plants are put in on the side of the vertical structure, and you tend to be using something that would otherwise be a ground cover or a perennial flower. Sometimes you're using herbs. Certainly not any really large plants in that, because they do have to be supported in that structure. But blazing star or liatris, coreopsis is a beautiful plant for that. Salvias and coneflowers can all be used in green walls, as well as vines like Confederate jasmine. There is a form of smilax or greenbrier that people grow on purpose. I was just as surprised. Trumpet creeper and Virginia creeper, morning glory, all really good options for this sort of growth. And so, you take something that would otherwise be a blank wall, and you have some really nice foliage and some really nice color coming off of that. And so not only again are you getting that benefit in terms of your cooling costs or your heating costs, but you also have just a gorgeous feature in the landscape. Green roofs kind of are the same idea as a green wall. Um, Instead of being wall, they're the roof. And it is essentially a vegetative or alternative to a traditional roofing material. And you're using those live growing media. So you can see a couple of examples here over on the what will be your right. It's kind of a more formal kind of way of doing it, but you will see houses that essentially have those green growing plants right on top of them. And the advantages of a green roof are very similar to the advantages of a green wall. Reducing your heating costs, providing additional insulation. They also, absorb rainwater and reduce stormwater runoff. Also, again, providing more potential living environments for butterflies and birds, other wildlife that we would like to have in our own landscape. And if you're looking at it from above, it certainly is a really attractive thing. Now, there are different kinds of green roofs. There are green roofs that we would call intensive, and green roofs that we would call extensive. Intensive green roof tend to have a growing media that's pretty thick, anywhere from 8 to 24 inches, and that means that kind of green roof we could even grow trees in that. So, we would think of that, more like we would think of our normal gardens. Obviously, there's a lot of weight that goes along with that. So the structure really has to be built to incorporate that kind of green roof. An extensive green roof has a much shallower soil, and that tends to be just herbaceous plants and ground covers. But still, that really adds a lot of green space in, particularly in urban environments. Having that additional green space can be really beneficial. With green roof design, there is a separation layer followed by layers of insulation. Of course, you need a moisture barrier. You don't want water coming into your building. Lots of protection for water movement. Then you have that media, and then the plants are grown on top of that. And there is a green roof down here on the coast of Mississippi that kind of is what we would consider that extensive green roof design. But we do see more and more of these being integrated into urban environments. Probably a little bit more accessible to most of us is the use of hedgerows. I think about these, you think about, large hedges or shelter belts. They are just basically living fences made up of trees and shrubs and vines and other plants. And there's a lot of benefits to these. Certainly they provide an attractive screen to screen off adjacent properties if you don't want to look at what your neighbor's doing in the backyard. But they also provide a buffer for wind and noise, even dust. They're providing a lot more space for wildlife. And they're also reducing soil erosion. So they're being able to hold in that soil on the edge of our properties. I did say I was going to talk about low maintenance landscapes. I think that's a really important element in sustainable design. And one thing that we really want to do is we want to have a plan for our landscape. And when we have that plan, we can look at areas that we're going to be using differently, areas where we might need a work area in the landscape, area where we might want to have a public entertaining area, and areas we might want to have just to ourselves, kind of a private area. And so one easy way to do this, I just took the drawing that I got from the surveyor when I got the property, blew it up a little bit bigger, and that gave me something that I could draw on and make little notes on in terms of what I want to put where in my landscape. You can do the same thing. These days, we can use online mapping or internet map programs, and you can get a satellite view of your property really easy to print that out and use that as a way that we can make notes and do different designs. Now, some things that we want to think about when we talk about low maintenance design. One part of that is probably one of the higher maintenance parts of our landscape is lawns, grass. Lawns are great. You know, people do enjoy them, but they do tend to be kind of expensive and they do tend to be kind of high maintenance. You got to mow them. Sometimes you do need to water them, fertilize them, use pesticides on them. So if we can reduce the amount of lawn space, we can reduce a lot of the work that we need to do in the landscape. So, if you have a nice green area with plants, with landscape plants, shrubs and perennials and ground covers, those tend to be a lot less maintenance in terms of the sort of the regular work that needs to go into them, rather than having that lawn space. And it's also providing in again opportunity for wildlife, an opportunity for food plants. So ultimately tends to be a more sustainable approach. When we do design areas in our landscape, we do want to think about the materials that we incorporate. We want to use long lasting materials, so concrete or brick patio, something like that can last 30 years, whereas something made out of wood may only last 5 or 8. I know that because I have a deck that I need to rebuild. Uh, so even something like recycled plastic lumber can last a really long time. It really does look good these days. So there is somewhat of a trade-off in terms of the initial cost and thinking about maintenance for that. So you do want to think about when you select an item for a landscape material, maybe it costs a little bit more initially, but if it costs 20% more but lasts twice as long, if you have the opportunity in the long run, you're going to be profiting by using that other material. One thing that I really like to do is make sure that the plants that I have in my landscape are pretty low maintenance. There's a lot of opportunities to use perennials for really great landscape color. So plants like daylilies, lantana, which is just great for butterflies and bees, Rudbeckia or black-eyed Susan, which you see driving down the road all the time right now. Echinacea or coneflower, which is just gorgeous and comes in all sorts of different colors. Evening primrose, which again you see wild, growing all over the place. Really low maintenance flowers that are gonna really not only just take up space that you don't have to fool with too much, but also provide you just gorgeous color in the landscape. We also, kind of want to be cautious that some of the plants that we really enjoy are high maintenance. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't use them. It just means that we need to kind of be cautious and conscious of that when we're selecting them and when we're putting them in. I love fruit trees. I like planting fruit trees, but fruit trees do take a little bit of effort in terms of managing them for insects or diseases, making sure their fertilization is just right. In my case, because I have citrus plants, even protecting them from the cold. Um, the other example that I use are hybrid roses. And as much as I say you want to be cautious of that because they do have a tendency to get some disease issues, I also grow them because I like to clip the flowers and take them to my wife. So I'm not saying don't use these. I'm saying that when you do that, maybe limit the number that you have to what you're going to feel comfortable managing in your landscape, and select varieties that are going to be really tolerant of the conditions that we have. The nursery industry has been great about designing and breeding varieties that are very well adapted, more resistant to disease issues. So when you're selecting those plants, make sure you select those improved varieties. Some more really good examples of low maintenance plants for ground covers. Monkey grass. I'm going to take Asian jasmine off that list because it does tend to spread like crazy. Sedum is one of my new favorites. I think it just does fantastically well and looks really gorgeous out in the landscape. Keep those irises in mind, particularly for wet areas. Lilies do fantastic. Verbena is another really great, sort of low growing perennial as well. Some really great shrubs for your landscape that are going to be really tough. Things like butterfly bush, Bedelia does fantastic. Vitex, I've got two that I still need to get in the ground that are already flowering and just look ridiculous right now. Wax myrtle, the only problem that I ever have with wax myrtle is that I have one and now I have five, because it does tend to try to propagate itself in the landscape. But there are some really good tough trees as well. Southern magnolia and American holly. My good old favorite red maple there. Really tough trees that perform very well in the landscape as well. Weed control is a garden task that just takes a lot of labor. Incorporating mulches and landscape fabrics can really reduce the amount of labor that we need. Um, I would recommend using both. So if you put down a landscape fabric, put a regular mulch over the top of that. Really looks more attractive, and it's going to give you, twice the benefit in terms of reducing weed management. Use some ground covers in there, some low growing plants that are going to be, that are going to take up that space. Pay attention to your plant spacing and pay attention to your fertilization, because all of those things are going to promote the growth of the plants that you enjoy growing, rather than the weeds that we want to get rid of. It's worth saying again, we do want to make sure that we're putting plants in where they're going to perform the best. Put the right size plant in the right place. You don't want to wind up in this situation where you have to cut your door out a couple of times a year, because that constant pruning that takes a lot of work, and it's also going to not be very good for the growth of the plant. So particularly pay attention, underneath windows and beside doorway entries. This weekend, it's already time for me to prune back my azaleas behind my house. They've stopped flowering, so I've got to get out there and cut them down beneath the windows again. Also, pay attention, particularly for trees. Pay attention about utility lines, because eventually the utility company will have to come along and cut those, and they often don't do that in a way that is particularly attractive for the plant. Ideally, when you put plants out in the landscape, it's good to put them in masses rather than individually. Creating shrub borders or large islands, that tends to reduce the need for the work that needs to go into it. So you're going to have less mowing, less weeding, less edging as a result of that. It's going to make it a lot easier to work out there in the landscape. And we don't have to have the most complicated landscape in the world. A simple landscape is okay. You don't have to have 500 different species of plants. Your landscape can be absolutely gorgeous just by selecting a smaller palette of really effective plants. And there's no shame in introducing a new one now and again. Just be conscious that we're trying to keep the amount of work and labor that goes into there a little bit less. And the last element, and probably the most important thing that I think that I can say in terms of sustainable design, is the last stage is to make sure that you get out there and spend time in your landscape. The whole virtue of having one is so that we can appreciate its beauty. I think that is just as important as every other element of sustainability. I hope you've enjoyed this. Again, I'm really just kind of giving a quick introduction through some topics that in the next several weeks, I'm going to be breaking out individually and discussing in a lot more depth. So if you've enjoyed this and you'd like to know more about these topics, please attend those presentations or look forward to those presentations by recording on YouTube. So thank you very much.